Today's workshop, like I said, is going to be on how to establish healthy boundaries, and especially right now with folks, stuck at home, really, maybe being around your family or a significant other for a long period of time. Even though we also need that closeness, it's really important for us to be able to set those boundaries in order for us to have space and to be able to take time for ourselves. So we'll talk a little bit about that today, different types of boundaries, as well as tips for being able to set healthy boundaries as a college student. So I really like this quote because we can think of relationships like a tree, right? We know that with trees, we need to have strong roots in order to help anchor the tree in the ground. And also, as the roots of the tree grow, the tree grows, and the tree grows stronger, bigger it develops. And our relationships have roots as well. And it's important to be able to remember that our relationships are always growing and developing, but they have to have strong roots. They have to be able to start from a strong, solid place. And that's where we're going to kind of keep in mind, our relationships today as well, because that's central to this concept of boundaries. So there are a lot of different types of boundaries, but a few that I've included, the ones that are most important, are material boundaries. So thinking about the tangibles, the things that we have. Where do we set that space? Our physical boundaries. Where do we kind of block off that space that is for us? Our mental boundaries and our emotional boundaries, and really thinking about setting these up so that other people don't broach them. That's something that's really important. Take some time to also think about what other types of boundaries there might be, and think about how these might play a role in your life. So, boundaries in relationships are extremely important because all healthy relationships require having boundaries. And a lot of times we might notice that if we're in a relationship without healthy boundaries, without set boundaries, that we might find ourselves being taken advantage of by a partner, by a friend, by a relative, a family member. We might start to feel resentful, and resentment often grows when we hold things in and not being able to voice what we're actually feeling. So if someone is consistently intruding on the boundaries that we're setting, regardless of the type, we might find that we start to hold on to a lot of that resentment towards a person, and that builds as we're not able to voice it. We might notice anger, and that might come out in our interactions with this person. We might also start to feel nervous, really unsure of ourselves, of the relationship in general, and unsure about how the other person might respond to us, and how another person might cause us to feel unsure of ourselves. And without healthy boundaries in relationships, we might find that codependence starts. Even abusive relationships can be marked by poor boundaries. So if we're not able to find a sense of self and being able to, have that line that is not to be crossed, then we might find ourselves becoming overly dependent on a partner, or we might set ourselves up to be taken advantage of to the point of abuse. And these are often signs that it might be an important time to seek out counseling or therapy to be able to build up that assertiveness, to be able to really look at what are the roots of my relationship? Again, going back to that tree, right? How can I not only strengthen myself, but being able to strengthen those roots in order to have healthy, strong relationships? So I know I gave very brief and not super detailed definitions of the four types of boundaries before that I had included, but um, this will give you a better sense of what these boundaries look like. So let's start with material boundaries. So this we can even put in context of school. So if a friend asks, "Hey, can I use your textbook in order to study for a test? I didn't purchase one, or I don't have it, and I really need to study." We think about who do we allow to use our tangible items. A family member might say, "Oh, I need to borrow your car. Can you lend me $20?" And this is often coming from a good place, but we also again have to think about what happens when this continued violation of material boundaries happens. Again, we might notice that's bringing up those feelings of resentment, maybe anger, and really being able to keep in mind when we're able to set that healthy, clear, delineated boundary. Physical boundaries, so physical contact, like a hug, and thinking about who is allowed into your personal bubble when, and really taking into account how big is your personal bubble. And it's also really important to remember that sexual boundaries also exist within this sphere, and that sort of gets us into that bigger picture of consent. Where do we draw that line where we aren't giving our bodies to another person without consent, without being mindful of those physical and sexual boundaries? Thinking about mental boundaries is also really important. Our mental boundaries pertain to our thoughts, our beliefs about a variety of different areas. And this might also pertain to your spiritual boundaries. So having a very deep root in the spiritual, in your faith playing a really important role in your life, and not being willing to compromise that, especially when spirituality, religion, faith often make up really big key parts of our identity. And emotional boundaries. These help us to handle our emotions in a healthy, appropriate way. Oftentimes, we might find that if our boundaries are violated consistently, especially our emotional boundaries, and people might be excuse me, manipulating us, or not taking the way that we are feeling seriously, again, going back to those feelings of resentment building up, really, really big difficulties in being able to manage anger, managing anxiety, feelings of sadness. These are also really important things to keep in mind. And there are a lot of questions that I want you guys to think about when you're reflecting on your boundaries. So let's walk through each. So material boundaries, thinking about who we're lending money to and how much. Are we consistently giving someone $50, or are we cutting them off at maybe $5? What are some situations where you're unwilling to do this? What would happen if they don't tell you what they're using the money for? Sharing clothes. This is often something that a roommate might ask. I know I had that experience, which is really strange, but regardless, sometimes people that we share space with might ask to borrow a shirt, pair of pants. Are certain items that are extremely personal to you off limits? And thinking about people asking, we're a lot more likely to lend people things, to let others borrow material objects if they ask. And sometimes we forget how basic that is. But really asking yourself, do people need to ask before they take my things? Now reflecting on physical boundaries. So let's think about that personal bubble. Right? how big is it? Where do we stretch it? Where does it expand? And when does it shrink back? Who's allowed to hug me? This is something that's also really important. And we think about being young kids, go give grandma a hug, go give grandma a kiss. That might be easier for some folks than others to open up that personal bubble and allow that physical contact. For a lot of reasons, that might not feel right for people, and we have to be able to respect that. And again, the A word, asking. Should people, including our friends and family, ask prior to physically touching me? And also reflecting on intimacy and our intimate relationships is so important. So really thinking about what are my own physical boundaries, and where do I feel comfortable being intimate, with whom, what does that look like, where and where do I give consent, and where does that stop? Now, mental boundaries, really reflecting on this in terms of, am I able to have discussions with other people without feeling like I have to prove someone else wrong? Do I protect my own ideas and thoughts? Are those sacred enough to me where I am not willing to budge on those? Who do I share my thoughts with? Who allows me to feel comfortable and secure in being able to discuss this with other people? Also thinking about, how do I share my ideas and thoughts? The means in which we're communicating is really important. Are we doing it verbally? Are we doing it through our actions? What are we, what and how are we doing to make that happen? And also really taking into account the influence of other people. Are we easily influenced by those around us to change our belief system, our values, the things that really matter to us, and our morals, kind of that ethic, those code of ethics, so to speak, that we live by and guide our decisions and our actions. And lastly, reflecting on emotional boundaries, asking yourself how comfortable you are sharing with family, friends, maybe acquaintances or peers, thinking about classes that might be more of a seminar style, discussion based. How comfortable do you feel being open about what you think of the topic and the subject matter? And for folks watching who might have participated in a therapy group before, whether it's at CAPS or elsewhere, how much do you feel comfortable sharing in group? There are some folks who feel very comfortable disclosing their emotions and how they're feeling, and other folks are more keen to sit back and listen. That doesn't mean that they're not getting something out of it. That just means that they're more content with being able to absorb in that way as opposed to sharing. Emotional expression is also really important to consider. Now, does that look like dumping things onto others? Use that term dump to sort of think about like just going to people and venting? Or do we let it build? Do we keep everything that we're feeling to ourselves? And again, thinking about resentment, anger, letting things build up where we feel like we don't have an outlet to be able to share those things. And at the same time, recognizing when we might feel more comfortable holding our emotions close and waiting until we really do feel safe to express how we're express our emotions and how we're feeling. And also asking ourselves, are we emotionally reactive? So what that means is, are we quick to anger? Do we have a low frustration tolerance? Do the actions of others, even if it's something really minor, cause us to become, to kind of go from 0 to 100 very quickly without really being able to take that step back and think before before we act. We can't necessarily control every single aspect of our emotions, especially we have primary emotions and fear. Fear, for example, that is sort of hardwired into us, right? That certain situations are just going to bring that out. But there are ways to be able to manage anger, manage frustration, being able to tolerate those emotions in a healthier way. Now, if people were watching my my workshop last week, there was also a values bullseye in my presentation that I talked about. I guess I just really like bullseyes, but this could be a really important and helpful activity to complete outside of this presentation, or if you're watching right now, maybe taking some time to take out a piece of paper and a pen and drawing this bullseye and labeling the different zones on the bullseye of what our personal boundaries might look like. So that red zone is strangers. We move to the yellow zone, which is acquaintances. The green zone, which is friends. Notice how it's getting closer and closer inward. The sky blue zone is our family. The indigo, we'll call it indigo, maybe regular blue, I don't know. Intimate relationships, and the bullseye is the self. And ask yourself these three questions. Who is in your intimate relationship circle? Who do you consider a friend versus an acquaintance? And that might be gauged by how much you feel comfortable sharing with the person, maybe how long you've known the person. And thinking about our family, we might feel closer to some family members than others. We might be able to tell them more. We might be able to tell certain family members more about how we're feeling. And we can be a little more flexible with our boundaries. With other relatives, we might feel like we have to hold things inside. Maybe we've had an experience with a relative where they've been very harsh or critical towards us and violated our mental, emotional, physical, or material boundaries. So if you want, take a minute, draw out this bullseye, and think about these three questions and really consider where things lie right now in your life. There are three types of boundary styles that I find really important to talk about when I'm working with someone on boundaries. We'll go through each one individually and look at them a bit more in depth. So, rigid boundaries. There are several characteristics of rigid boundaries. So the first is avoiding intimacy and close relationships. This might stem from a past history of being in intimate or close relationships and having our boundaries violated. As a result, we learn from that experience to not get close to other people. Being unlikely to ask for help might be another sign of rigid boundaries. Perhaps we've had experience with our parents, maybe, where we've asked them for help, but they weren't responsive. They just said, figure it out yourself. That can be very invalidating. And as a result, we learn from those experiences that other people are going to be just like our parents and not likely to help us, even when we ask. Being very protective of personal information is another sign of rigid boundaries. So thinking about, where do we draw that line with what we share versus what we don't share. Someone might have taken advantage of us in the past and used our personal information for their gain. Again, a really, really significant boundary violation, and it leads us to be very protective of the information that matters most to us. With rigid boundaries, a person who holds rigid boundaries might seem detached, might not seem 100% there, even with people who are in their inner circle, let's say. So your closest group of friends, your immediate family, maybe a relationship with a partner, a spouse, um, just might not feel connected and might not want to be as open, might not be willing because of these past experiences with boundary violations to be, you know, to feel connected, not wanting to take that risk. And last, rigid boundaries often look like we're keeping others at a distance to avoid the possibility of rejection. So maybe we've been in a relationship before where we felt very, very connected to a person, and we thought that we could see the relationship getting very deep, but it ended. And as a result, we don't want to get close to others because they might reject us. They might push us away. So we know that when something is rigid, it's very, very set, very hard to move. Now that we have a better understanding of rigid boundaries, we're going to look at porous boundaries. So this is almost thinking of like a sponge as porous, right? A lot of little areas for things to seep in, or not being as firm with those boundaries, being overly flexible. So an individual with porous boundaries might overshare personal information. They might struggle to say no to the requests of others, sort of that feeling of needing to be a people pleaser, right? Being over involved with others' problems, and sometimes this might be a way of avoiding their own problems, or it could also just be a way of wanting to be able to help others, feeling like this is what they need to do. Being accepting of abuse or disrespect in relationships, or again, the R word, resentment, right? Holding on to that, really letting it build inside, but not enforcing any consequences for the individual or individuals that are responsible for this abuse or disrespect. And finally, individuals with porous boundaries are fearful of rejection. And this might stem from what might happen if they don't comply with other people. Again, looking at past experiences, maybe if they haven't, if they've tried to be assertive with their boundaries and not complying with others in the past, they might have ended up being rejected or even just feeling rejected. And this is, again, something really important to take into account. And now we have the healthy middle ground, healthy boundaries. With healthy boundaries, we value our own opinions as well as the opinions of others. We don't compromise our values and the things that really matter to us just to make other people happy or to be more likely of accepting us. We're more careful about the way in which we share personal information. We are very deliberate in asking ourselves, to what degree am I willing to be open about certain things? Am I close enough to this person to be able to be open in a way with my own personal information that feels comfortable? Do we know with healthy boundaries, a person knows their personal wants and needs and is able to communicate them? And they can accept when others say no to them, because ultimately we are going to hear no, and that's not something that we like to hear, but rejection is a part of the human experience. And to be able to build that acceptance, even though it doesn't just erase the pain that might stem from rejection or hearing no, is a very important skill and a really significant sign of healthy boundaries. So now that we have a better idea of the three ways that we can approach boundaries, rigid, porous, and healthy, I'd like everyone to go through and do this experiential activity with me. So again, getting your pen and paper out, think of one relationship that you might be struggling with currently. Maybe this is with a roommate. This might be with a friend, a significant other, or a parent, could even be a sibling. And try and write down or reflect upon the various types of boundaries and the set of expectations that you and this other individual have. So it involves some perspective taking. So knowing the different types of boundaries that we've discussed today, material, physical, mental, and emotional, think about the set of expectations that you and this other person have in the context of those 4 types of boundaries. And ask yourself if there are any areas where you feel resentful or angry. Is there action taken that, or have you been taken advantage of? And are there certain boundaries that have not been set that you would like to set in this relationship? Again, thinking about those, those 3 different approaches: rigid, porous, or healthy. If we're thinking about a relationship that you're struggling with, the boundaries might look either more rigid or more porous. So really kind of taking those 2 into account. So I'll give everyone a minute or 2 to do this, and it's also something that you can continue to work on after the workshop. All right, another minute. Right. Now, this is something, again, it's a living activity that you can always build on when, when you have time to continue to sit down and really think in even more depth about this relationship. Now, enforcing boundaries is really, really hard. Being able to establish these boundaries is tough, and there can be a lot of overlapping reasons why it's so hard. And we're going to go through some reasons why boundaries may be difficult for these individuals. So this could stem from a deep-seated belief that putting one's own needs first is selfish. That could also stem from culture, right? More collectivist cultures, sort of thinking about the greater good as opposed to an individualistic culture where we're thinking more about our own needs. There are very specific differences. Not being aware, knowing our own boundaries, not having started to really think about what our own boundaries look like. Feeling like we don't have the right to enforce those boundaries, and particularly with certain people or in certain situations. We might also have the belief that setting boundaries may negatively affect the relationship. We learned from childhood, right, that we might not have had or been exposed to healthy boundaries, whether that's with parents, siblings, and based on past experiences, again, we might have attempted to enforce and establish healthy boundaries with people, but they weren't respected. And all of these reasons put together can make it really difficult to enforce these boundaries, and it can feel very demoralizing. So we're going to look at different tips on how to set these boundaries, make them strong. And this starts with assertiveness. And I'm sure that everyone has heard this term before. Maybe you've heard about practicing I statements. So I feel or I think, the third person, versus blaming another person or using you, the third person. So an example might be I feel rejected or I feel hurt, instead of you're mean, or I feel that you are selfish with your time. So we're trying not to criticize the other person, because then that might make it less likely that they're going to ultimately respect the boundaries that we are trying to set. So that means being an assertive listener when setting boundaries and communicating our needs. Saying no. Sometimes this can be the hardest part. Again, thinking about your own tendencies. Maybe you lean more towards that people pleasing side, and saying no is a big no-no. But we have to be able to say no in order to get our needs and wants met. And using skills. Perhaps some of you, again, thinking about whether you've maybe been in therapy before and you've learned about DBT. I know one of my colleagues gave a presentation earlier on about DBT, dialectical behavior therapy. And there's a skill that I'm going to talk about with you called DEARMAN, and that's an acronym for the different aspects of what it looks like to be effective in communicating your needs and wants to establish assertiveness. So how do we get our needs met effectively? This is DEARMAN. So let's go through each. D, describe. Describing the current situations using only the facts. We move on to E, expressing. This is where we express our feelings and our opinions, what we really think. A, assert. I would say this is probably the hardest part of DEARMAN. Having to ask for what you want. That might feel very uncomfortable for people, but we have to be able to do it to get our needs met. Next, we move on to reinforcing. What's the reward for the other individual? And what are the negative consequences if the other individual does not respond? M, mindfulness. So being present, being aware of what's happening, and being non-judgmental of ourselves and the other person. A, appear confident, effective, and competent. So knowing what you are going to say and approaching it with a sense of confidence. And the N is negotiating. So we know that negotiating can be really hard, but we have to negotiate, we have to compromise. If we want to get something, that often means that we have to be willing to give. But this is another really important way to have our needs met. We're usually not just going to have another person give us everything that we ask for. We have to be willing to negotiate and compromise. So, DEARMAN, I included this little graphic. Now let's see if the video will play.
Skills teach you how to ask for something from someone.
right. So that kind of sums up Dear Man with a bit of a better video graphic. I know it's a little interesting that they didn't have facial features, but I really think that this was the best way to be able to explain Dear Man and how that really is the most effective way to make a request. Now, again, it's something you have to practice. It's challenging, but over time it becomes more natural. Right. So we're also going to look at some other acronyms really quick. So give and fast. So relationship effectiveness is give. The skill can help you keep healthy, positive relationships. So the G stands for gentle. So being kind, being soft, being compassionate. Interested, appearing interested in what the other person is saying. That might mean leaning forward, nodding your head, good eye contact. V stands for validate. Let them know that what they're saying is important and letting that be known. And E, easy manner, not going into this as something that is so serious and making the other person feel intimidated. And now we move on to FAST. Now this acronym is self-respect effectiveness. So practicing our FAST skills can help us to feel good about ourselves, regardless of the outcome of a situation. So F stands for fairness. A stands for no apologies. S, sticking to your values, again, not compromising the things that are most important to you. And the T stands for being truthful. Tell the other person what you're feeling. Don't lie, don't make things up to try and make the situation less uncomfortable. It's probably going to feel uncomfortable, but you have to be honest about what you're feeling and communicate that to the other person. So relationship effectiveness, give. Fast, self-respect effectiveness, feeling good about ourselves. Now, the second experiential activity that I'd like everyone to do is to create your own script using the Dear Man skill. Now, if there's a boundary that you're looking to put into place in a meaningful relationship in your life, this is a great way to ask for it. So an example that I think is really helpful is, that I think is really good, is thinking about one of your boundaries is maybe, texting at the dinner table. That is something that is often really disruptive and takes away from the present moment of being with others and aware of what you're eating, who you're with, and how would you ask for this using the Dear Man skill while also incorporating those give and fast skills? So how do we get our needs and wants met while also making sure that we're being effective in the relationship as well as maintaining our own self-respect? So we'll give everyone a minute or two to at least start. And from there, again, something to continue working on as we move forward, and something that you'll work on outside of here for sure. All right, another minute or so to put the beginning touches on your script. right. So you've started the skeleton of the script. And as you continue working on it and you put it together and they're the finishing touches and it looks good and you want to go to another person and put it into action. You try and it doesn't work. I hear that a lot. Hey, you told me to use these things and I did, and it doesn't work, and it didn't work. And now I'm angry and I don't want to keep doing it. Okay, fair enough. Sometimes people are not receptive to boundaries being put into place, and sometimes asserting ourselves doesn't result in the outcome that we would like. In those situations, there are some different skills that you can use, some different approaches. Validation. I know I mentioned validation earlier, but allowing the other person to express what they're feeling and being able to hear what they're saying and accepting that, even if we don't agree with it. The broken record, so we all know what a broken record is, kind of on repeat, being able to continue to push. Probing, so asking why the other person isn't receptive to our boundaries being put into place. And clouding and assertive delay. So thinking about how might we agree with a person who is not willing to or receptive to boundaries being put into place, or maybe assertively delaying it. Okay, so you're not ready to hear what I'm saying right now, but we are going to return to this later. So just some different things to think about and trying so that we don't become so discouraged that we don't work towards establishing these healthy boundaries that will only in the long run help our relationships to grow. So this is the power and control wheel. Some boundaries should never be crossed. And if any of these boundaries that are listed here are ever crossed in a relationship, this is the time to seek help. And we're going to go through each using coercion and threats. So carrying out threats to do something to someone in a relationship might make or carry out threats to do something to harm you, such as threatening to leave or commit suicide, driving recklessly to threaten you, or to frighten you, and threatening others who are important to you. It also includes stalking as well. Intimidation, making you afraid, using looks, gestures, actions, perhaps abusing pets, smashing things, brandishing weapons, using emotional abuse, putting you down all the time, calling you names, making you just in general feel badly about yourself. Humiliation is another significant part of what emotional abuse looks like. And it can also lead you to question your own identity. Isolation. We see this manifest as control. So the controlling partner that controls who you see, who you talk to, the things that you do, making you have to account for your whereabouts all the time, telling you that if you bring up what's happening in the relationship, that no one is going to believe you, and always being with you, not letting you have any space for yourself. Denying, minimizing, and blaming. So making light of the abuse, saying that it never happened, not taking responsibility, saying it's just fighting, or you're doing the same thing, or mutual abuse. And sometimes a partner or another person in the relationship might accuse you of making them abuse you. Using children as a manipulation tool, making you feel guilty about the children, using children to relay messages, threatening to take the kids away, that you have no parental rights, potentially threatening to tell the authorities to take your children, using them as a weapon against you. Privilege, treating you like a servant. This might mean that in the relationship, the other person is making all the decisions, defining the roles or duties in the relationship, using their privilege to discredit you, maybe cutting off access to resources, or saying that they are the only one that knows what's best for you. And last but not least is economic abuse. So preventing you from getting or keeping a job, making you ask for money, interfering with work or schooling, taking your credit cards or cash without permission, requiring you to provide all the support, it could be the other way, and keeping your name off joint assets. So this is a good list. I'm not going to read through all of them, of different boundaries that you might set with yourself. So especially now with COVID happening, it might be harder to establish that same sense of structure, routine that you had when that you were on campus and classes were consistent, and you had a routine that was familiar. We might notice now that our hours are off. And these are just some important examples of boundaries you might want to set with yourself. Asking yourself these questions about the types of boundaries that you will set is really important. Are there boundaries in your life that you want to set for you, not for anyone else but yourself? Thinking about those three different approaches. Are you more rigid, porous, or healthy in your boundary style with yourself? And asking yourself, what are the steps that I need to take in order to get on that path to start taking action on setting these boundaries? So with all of that in mind, I hope that today's presentation was of benefit. And establishing healthy boundaries is extremely important at all stages of our lives, and not only setting healthy boundaries with others, but being able to set healthy boundaries with ourselves. I hope that this presentation was of use, and that these are skills that you can use moving forward. Thank you so much. Have a good one.